When I was younger, I used to enjoy watching The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross. It was a peaceful experience, up to a point, because he would create these beautiful nature scenes of mountains or forests with a stream or some other serene image, encouraging others to explore their realized or longingly hoped for artistic talent. And then, just when the painting seemed complete, at least to my eyes, he'd decide that the scene needed a happy little cloud or a happy little tree. And with that, he would take some more paint on his brush and proceed to add a thick, dark brown line, followed by dark greens of evergreen branches or bright colors of fall leaves. And when it was finished, the painting looked even better. But for those who were trying to create their own versions at home, it was a risky moment. That initial stroke of a brush altered the landscape and had the potential to ruin the painting, despite Bob Ross's assurance that there are no mistakes, just happy accidents. What might be true for a painting may not be the same for us in the choices we make. We don't necessarily have that same easy trust that everything will work out in beautiful ways. In life, most of us face times when a choice that we make has a dramatic impact on how our life will unfold from that time forward. And so do we choose a bold action and risk ruining what we have worked so hard to create for the sake of something that could be even more amazing? Or do we play it safe and stick what is familiar or known, even if it's less than what we dream? That's the choice that Joseph faced. We don't know much about him beyond the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke. Joseph doesn't have any direct presence in the Gospels. We know nothing, almost nothing, about his life and personality, but we can imagine that things were going fairly well for him. He seemed to have a good job as a carpenter. He was engaged, and for a first century peasant in Nazareth, things were looking good. Marriage wasn't reserved for love, but I like to imagine that Joseph appreciated the spirit that he saw in Mary. And so it must have come as a big shock when he discovered that she was pregnant. He knew he didn't have anything to do with it, and with that awareness, what he dreamed their future might look like was stripped away. An unexpected mark on the canvas he had been creating. By local custom, he could have had her publicly humiliated, sent away, punished for a crime of infidelity. But the narrative tells us something about his character. Although likely hurt and betrayed, he decided to end the relationship quietly, allowing each of them to keep whatever dignity possible. But then he had this dream that told him to go ahead, that this relationship would lead to a child who would not be born as his own, but would be unlike any people had known before. Joseph, who dared to hope for a better outcome than the one he saw, decided to risk believing that the dream was from God and not just a product of his imagination. He chose to take a bold brushstroke to follow through with the plan to marry Mary, even though the picture would be far different from how he had originally imagined it. As risks go, this one might not seem all that dramatic. His choice might have affected his reputation, but his life probably wasn't in danger. The risks he took to trust in God were largely internal. He chose to believe in what he couldn't see and to act in ways that were different from societal norms. While we don't hear his words, in nativity scenes, he is almost always right beside Mary. In a patriarchal society, he not only protected her, he accepted that he was not the main focus in that family. He listened to God and listened to Mary, quietly holding a faith that kept hope in the coming of a Messiah who would be the fulfillment of God's promises. For Joseph, the beginning of the story of God with him, of God with us, began in a dream. But it was a dream that had been passed down from one generation to another, a collective vision for a way beyond the struggles that they experienced. They had known times of exile and restoration, and they were living in occupied territory. The dreams expressed by the prophets, by stories and songs, taught them to keep a vision alive, that they would know peace, even when they weren't experiencing it. Bishop Michael Curry has named that the language of a dream is the language of hope. What we can dream gives us a vision. And hope allows us to continue to dream, even when it takes a long time for it to be realized. When have you been in a position to be like Joseph? To intentionally stand with someone who is vulnerable or marginalized? Maybe it's in the form of protests or boycotts, demonstrating with your presence and actions a willingness to sacrifice time or goods to demonstrate care that wouldn't have to directly impact you. That kind of risk happens when we choose to care about people who don't have a choice about whether to care about what is happening. What might begin as compassion, caring for another's struggles, expands to encompass empathy, an ability to feel with others, to walk with them in their pain and struggle and fear, even in times where there may be disagreements. Sometimes we get to choose with whom we will partner. And sometimes, like Joseph and Mary, a relationship compels us to risk vulnerability. Mary's part in this story has received far more attention. While Joseph's risks were internal, Mary had an obvious external component to her life and risk-taking. Her presence is much more visible, and we hear her voice. She learned how she would be part of the story, not from a dream, but from a visit from the angel Gabriel. It's understandable that she initially doubted how it would be possible for her to have a child. And it wasn't until she went to her relative Elizabeth that she was able to claim for herself words often known as the Magnificat. A member of a former congregation used to say regarding the Magnificat, who knew that a first-century peasant would be able to speak in iambic pentameter? The words she said may not have been exactly as we have received them, but the message they carry have been an inspiration for faithful believers and for those who are desperate for something to change. So I invite you to hear these words from Luke 1:46 to 55 from the New Egalitarian Translation. My soul proclaims your greatness, O God, and my spirit rejoices in you, my Savior, because you have shown favor on your lowly servant. And from this moment on, all generations will call me blessed, because you, the Almighty, have done great things for me, and holy is your name. Your mercy reaches from generation to generation for all who honor you. You have shown strength in your arm, and you have scattered the proud in their conceit. You have deposed the mighty from their thrones and have lifted the lowly to high places. You have filled the hungry with good things and have sent the rich away empty. You have come to the aid of your servant Israel, mindful of your mercy, a promise you made to our ancestors, to Sarah and Abraham and their descendants forever. Mary never asked to have this dramatic change in her life. Initially, fear was probably overwhelming. To say yes to God's invitation was to put everything at risk. She could have been stoned or at least cut off from all who knew her. If it hadn't been for Elizabeth, whose welcome and perspective gave her strength and encouragement to hope beyond her fears, it's hard to imagine what could have happened. I recently read a Facebook post originally written by Caitlin Sheese. And recalling Mary's connection to Elizabeth, it said, "Every discussion of biblical womanhood should include the fact that in Luke 1, 2 pregnant women celebrate their new motherhood by passionately discussing the coming overthrow of every earthly empire." Amen? Mary's proclamation begins with praise and gratitude for the ways that God has blessed her. But then the tone changes, or it can. Mary not only finds her voice, she calls on God to make good on promises that had been held for millennia. She spoke of what had not yet happened as if it is already a given. The Reverend Shavon Starling Lewis writes of the connections between Mary and the liberation proclaimed by womanist theologians. Rooted in the experience and perspectives of Black women, Mary's song embodies the disorientation and reorientation of people whose lives have been turned upside down. Starling Lewis calls Mary outrageous, audacious, and courageous. And as she moves through the Magnificat, she is responsible, in charge, and serious. The transformation of her body prepares the way for God's transforming power in Jesus. Mary knows that God is the source of her liberation, and her rejoicing comes from recognizing a power within herself to be more than an object in history. God's mercy, it's not just for a small group of people, but for the fullness of humanity. Mary's song connects generations whose power is not in what has taken place, but is what happens when people join with God to embody hope and love. Faith is the source of strength to risk dangers, to realize a better way of being. Hope is a dangerous thing. It leads us to have courage to do things we might otherwise be too afraid to try. Author Alison Peleas writes of a conversation she had with a Black professor about activism. And she commended the professor for her courage. But the professor replied that to have courage is also to have fear, and went on to say, "I have none about the work or mission, which in itself makes me dangerous." To live as Christians, to fully believe in following the path of Jesus, to dare to hope when the way is not clear, is dangerous. Whether it comes in the form of peaceful protests, marches, stepping in front of military forces, or simply refusing to accept oppressive structures. Hoping, believing in our heart in a different way, in God's way, leads us to respond to others and ourselves in ways that may surprise even us. The message we strive to live from the Magnificat is collective liberation. Through Mary's willingness to risk hope, we discover that we too hold power of God's promises in our lives. Just as we have likely each had times when we've had the opportunity to risk like Joseph. Many, if not all of us, have also had times when we've been asked to embody hope for the sake of our lives or those whom we love. What it means to risk hope could look different for each one of us. For some, it is embodied in acts of resistance and a commitment to agape love at all costs. For others, risking hope is standing firm in our convictions when everything else and everyone else says to give up. Hope allows us to expect with confidence what we cannot yet see with our eyes. Theologian Walter Brueggemann said that peace promised in God's reign is known only in the inclusive, caring community. Peleas writes that we hold on to hope so that we can continue to mold our word to be on earth as it is in heaven. And hope urges us to reach for God's reign where there is no shortage of blessing for the earth and all who live, and tells us that that reign lives in us. We are still waiting for the fullness of the dream of God's shalom to be realized. We see the struggles of those who don't have enough to eat, while others of us end up throwing away food that has gone bad. We live with economic inequalities where some have far more than they need and others don't have basic human needs of shelter, food, and clothing. We have divisions along lines of culture, inclusion, education, belief, access to decision-making power. It can be discouraging to keep hoping for what seems just beyond our grasp. But sometimes encouragement comes in less than likely sources. While Bishop Curry spoke of the connection between dreams and hope, rapper LL Cool J not generally brought up as a theologian, said dreams don't have deadlines. I think when you move past your fear and you go after your dreams wholeheartedly, you become free. Risking hope is a willingness to create bold designs and to make our mark on the canvas of our lives. To be bold in our own way, to believe in dreams of a different world from what we already know. We take this journey together. Like the quilt square design, traditionally called birds in the air, we risk dreaming of a future that is better than what we see. We rise together in our dreams, strengthened by a faith that frees us to believe in what has been told. In this season, believe in dreams, risk hope, work together, rejoice in bold and meek actions, whatever shape they may take. May it be so.